Imagine the unimaginable: a mother sitting in a courtroom, presiding over a routine case, only to see a clue: a necklace that sends her world spiraling. That same necklace was last seen on her daughter, Emily, who vanished without a trace 15 years ago. This story takes you on a gripping journey of love, loss, and resilience as Judge Margaret Lorne fights to uncover the truth about her daughter's disappearance. Alongside a tenacious investigator and a daughter determined to confront her own demons, Margaret uncovers a dangerous web of lies, corruption, and betrayal. But who can she trust? How far will she go to bring her family back together? And what dark secrets does the Echoes, an underground organization, hold over them all? If you're ready for an emotional roller coaster packed with mystery, action, and heart, this is the story for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible tale. Now, settle in and prepare yourself for a journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's begin. Margaret Lorne sat in her chambers, her fingers drumming against the polished wood of her desk. It was a small tic she had developed in her earliest days as a judge, a way to funnel nervous energy during moments of tension. Today, the rhythm was relentless. The file on her desk seemed innocuous at first glance, just another stack of paper outlining another criminal case. She had presided over dozens like it before, but this one felt different. Connor Reed, accused of kidnapping and murdering Sophie Maynard, had been in custody for nearly 2 years, protesting his innocence. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and yet the public had already condemned him. Margaret opened the file again, her sharp eyes scanning the details she already knew by heart. Sophie, 23, last seen leaving her apartment late one evening. Witnesses reported seeing a man following her, a man who resembled Connor Reed. A necklace, identical to the one Sophie was known to wear, was found among his belongings. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Margaret called, her voice even. Anna Fuller, her young clerk, stepped inside with a clipboard pressed against her chest. "Judge Lorne, they're ready for you in the courtroom." Margaret stood, smoothing the black robe over her shoulders. "How's the room?" "Packed," Anna replied, her tone tinged with nervous energy. "The media's out in full force. They're calling it the trial of the decade." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She hated these sensationalized cases, where public opinion often overshadowed justice. As she walked through the corridor toward the courtroom, the weight of her robe felt heavier than usual. The voices of reporters outside filtered through the walls, a constant buzz that seemed to vibrate through her chest. The courtroom was a sea of faces when Margaret entered. Spectators packed every bench, while others stood along the walls, craning their necks for a better view. Reporters jotted notes in rapid shorthand, their eyes darting between the defendant and the judge's bench. Connor Reed sat at the defense table, his posture rigid. He wore a cheap suit that hung awkwardly on his thin frame, but it was his face that drew Margaret's attention. Pale, almost gaunt, with deep-set eyes that flickered nervously toward the gallery. He looked more like a man drowning in despair than a cold-blooded criminal. Margaret's gaze shifted and then froze. The necklace. It hung around Connor's neck, the delicate silver chain catching the light as he moved. The small pendant, engraved with intricate patterns, was unmistakable. Her heart lurched. Emily. Margaret's throat tightened, her mind suddenly awash with memories. Her daughter, 15 years old, had worn a necklace just like that the day she disappeared 15 years ago. Margaret gripped the edge of the bench, forcing herself to steady her breathing. She had to remain impartial, to focus on the case at hand. But the sight of that necklace, a ghost from her past, made it nearly impossible. The prosecutor began his opening remarks, but Margaret barely heard him. Her eyes kept returning to the pendant, her thoughts racing. Could it be the same one? Could Connor Reed be connected to Emily's disappearance? The room felt stifling, the air heavy and oppressive. Margaret fought to concentrate, but a wave of dizziness swept over her. She clutched the bench for support, but the walls seemed to close in, the voices around her growing distant. "Judge Lorne," someone called. Margaret's vision blurred. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the necklace, gleaming like a shard of broken glass. Margaret awoke to the sterile brightness of the courthouse infirmary. The faint hum of a nearby machine filled the air, along with the antiseptic tang of cleaning supplies. Anna sat beside her, worry etched across her face. "Judge Lorne, you're awake," she said, her voice soft but urgent. Margaret tried to sit up, wincing at the sharp ache in her temples. "What happened?" "You fainted," Anna explained. "In the middle of the hearing. The doctor said it was stress, but they want you to rest." Margaret shook her head. "I can't rest. The trial has been postponed," Anna interrupted firmly. "Your health is more important." Margaret frowned, her thoughts already drifting back to the courtroom. The defendant, Connor Reed, the necklace he was wearing. Anna tilted her head. "The necklace? Why?" Margaret hesitated, weighing her words. "It looked familiar. I need you to find out where he got it." Anna's brow furrowed. "I'll see what I can do. But Judge, maybe you should." "Just do it," Margaret said sharply, her voice softening a moment later. "Please." Anna nodded, though her concern lingered. Connor Reed sat on the narrow cot in his cell, the rough fabric of his prison-issued uniform chafing against his skin. He rubbed his hands together absent-mindedly, staring at the floor as though it might hold the answers to the questions that plagued him. The trial had been a circus from the beginning. He had lost count of the number of times he'd told his lawyer he was innocent, only to be met with tired reassurances. His fingers brushed against the necklace hanging around his neck, the cool metal a small comfort against his skin. He clenched it tightly, his knuckles widening. Sophie had given it to him the night before she disappeared. She had pressed it into his hand, her eyes wide with something between fear and desperation. "Keep it safe," she had whispered. He had thought it was just a token, something sentimental. But now, with everything that had happened, it felt more like a curse. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, the faint glow of her desk lamp illuminating stacks of papers and photographs. She had pulled Emily's belongings from storage for the first time in years, her fingers trembling as she opened the dusty box. Inside were remnants of a life frozen in time, a worn leather diary, a handful of Polaroid photos, and a silver chain with a matching pendant to the one Connor had worn. Margaret picked up the necklace, her thumb tracing the familiar engraving. She had given it to Emily on her 15th birthday, a symbol of their bond. Seeing it now, its twin around the neck of an accused criminal, felt like a cruel twist of fate. The sharp knock at her door startled her. Anna entered, holding a thin file. "Judge, I found something about the necklace." Margaret motioned for her to continue, her heart pounding. "It's a custom piece," Anna explained. "Made by a local jeweler about 15 years ago. Paid for in cash by someone who didn't leave a name. But the jeweler noted a detail, Davenport." Margaret's breath hitched. "Davenport? I know that. I looked into it. The name Caleb Davenport keeps popping up in connection to both Emily and Sophie. It's thin, but it's something," Margaret finished. Margaret's grip tightened on the necklace as Anna's words replayed in her mind. Caleb Davenport. It wasn't a name she recognized, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. She placed the necklace back into the box, carefully arranging Emily's belongings as though the order might summon clarity. The faint scent of lavender lingered on the old diary, a detail that tugged painfully at Margaret's heart. Lavender had been Emily's favorite, her go-to fragrance, her preferred tea, and the flower she pressed between pages. "Thank you, Anna," Margaret said softly, her gaze still fixed on the diary. "Leave the file with me." Anna hesitated. "Are you sure you don't need anything else? You've had a long day." Margaret shook her head, forcing a thin smile. "Il est fine. Get some rest." When Anna left, Margaret opened the diary. The pages crackled faintly, the ink slightly faded. Most of the entries were typical for a teenager, musings about school, friends, and fleeting crushes. But as Margaret neared the final pages, a darker tone emerged. "Mom doesn't understand me. She's always trying to control everything I do. She says it's because she loves me, but I feel like I'm suffocating." Margaret's throat tightened. She remembered the arguments, the tension, the moments when her love had felt like chains to Emily. The final entry was brief, CD says he can help me. I'll just have to trust him. Freedom is worth the risk. Margaret's fingers trembled. CD Caleb Davenport. Emily had written those words days before she disappeared. The following morning, Margaret decided to visit Samuel Hart, the jeweler who had created the necklace. It was a decision she made on impulse, despite Anna's protest that she needed more rest. The shop was tucked away on a quiet street, its wooden sign worn and weathered. A faint jingle of bells announced Margaret's arrival as she stepped inside. The interior was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with glass cases displaying intricate rings, bracelets, and pendants. Behind the counter stood Samuel, a thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and a jeweler's loop perched on his forehead. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice gruff but polite. Margaret approached the counter, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Mr. Hart, I believe you spoke to my assistant yesterday about a necklace." Samuel tilted his head, then nodded. "Ah, yes. The custom piece from years ago. It's not often people come asking about work that old." Margaret reached into her bag and produced the photograph of Connor wearing the necklace. "Do you remember who commissioned it?" Samuel took the photo, adjusting his loop as he studied it. "I remember the piece well. Unique design. The buyer insisted on specific details, the engraving, the chain length. Paid in cash. Did he give a name?" Samuel hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Not directly, but I caught a glimpse of his ID when he pulled out his wallet. The name on it was Caleb Davenport." The confirmation hit Margaret like a blow. "Did he say who the necklace was for?" "No," Samuel replied. "But he seemed nervous, jumpy, like he didn't want to be seen." Margaret thanked him and left the shop, her mind racing. Caleb Davenport wasn't just a shadow in Emily's diary. He was real, connected to the necklace, and possibly to her daughter's disappearance. Back in his cell, Connor Reed sat on the edge of his cot, his elbows resting on his knees. He had spent the past hour replaying his last conversation with Sophie Maynard, her voice a faint echo in his mind. "You don't understand," Sophie had said, her voice tinged with desperation. "These people, they're everywhere. If they think I know too much, if they even suspect I'll disappear." Connor had brushed off her fears at the time, thinking them irrational. But when Sophie vanished the next day, her words took on a haunting clarity. Now, as he stared at the cracked pane on the cell walls, the sound of approaching footsteps broke his reverie. A guard appeared, motioning for Connor to follow. "Inquiry from the judge," the guard said gruffly. Connor frowned. "Judge Lorne. What did she want with him now?" Seated in a private interrogation room, Connor found himself face to face with Margaret. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes piercing as she regarded him. "Mr. Reed," she began, her tone calm but firm. "You know why I've called you here." Connor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "If you're here to grill me, you're wasting your time. I already told the cops everything I know." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "And yet, there's still so much you haven't said." She gestured to the necklace. "Where did you get that?" Connor's fingers instinctively went to the pendant. "It was a gift." "From Sophie?" "Yes," Connor admitted. "She gave it to me the night before she disappeared. Told me to keep it safe." Margaret's heart pounded. "Did she tell you why?" Connor hesitated. "She said it was important, that it meant something to someone. She was scared, Judge. Terrified, actually, but she wouldn't tell me what it was all about." Margaret's gaze hardened. "And you didn't think to ask?" "I tried," Connor snapped. "But she said the less I knew, the safer I'd be." A day later, she was gone. The room fell silent. Margaret studied Connor, searching for any hint of deception, but his eyes held only exhaustion and a flicker of something else, regret. That evening, Margaret made a call she had been avoiding for years. "Elliot Graham," a deep voice answered. "Elliot, it's Margaret." A pause. "Judge Lorne," he said, surprise evident in his tone. "It's been a long time. What can I do for you?" Margaret hesitated, then said, "I need your help. It's about Emily." Elliot agreed to meet her at a quiet diner the following morning. Over steaming cups of coffee, Margaret laid out everything she had discovered. The necklace, Connor Reed's connection to Sophie Maynard, and the name Caleb Davenport. Elliot listened intently, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed her words. Caleb Davenport, he repeated. That name rings a bell, but I can't place it. He's the key to all of this, Margaret said. I'm sure of it. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. If he's involved, finding him won't be easy. But I'll see what I can dig up. Margaret returned home late that night, exhausted but determined. The events of the past few days had reopened old wounds, but they had also ignited a fire within her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was making progress, like she was getting closer to the truth about Emily. She sat in her study, the photo of her daughter on the desk before her. I'm coming for you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I won't stop until I find you. Elliot Graham sat in his office, surrounded by the detritus of a long career in private investigation. Old case files spilled from filing cabinets, and the corkboard on the wall was a chaotic map of string and pinned photographs. In the center of his desk was a single name scrawled on a notepad, Caleb Davenport. The name had lodged itself in Elliot's mind like a splinter. He had spent the better part of the day combing through public records, tracing every thread he could find. Most led nowhere. Caleb Davenport was a ghost, his presence fleeting and elusive. But ghosts always left traces, and Elliot prided himself on finding them. He leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking as he reviewed his notes. A property deed had caught his attention, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, purchased 15 years ago under one of Davenport's shell companies. The transaction was unremarkable except for the timing. It coincided with Emily Lorne's disappearance. Elliot tapped his pen against the desk, a habit he developed when he was onto something big. Time to pay a visit, he muttered. Margaret paced her living room, the sound of her heels muffled by the plush carpet. Her mind churned with doubts and memories, each one more painful than the last. She had spent years convincing herself she had done everything she could for Emily, but now those convictions felt hollow. The diary entry about Caleb Davenport haunted her. CD says he can help me. Freedom is worth the risk. Margaret had always thought she was protecting her daughter, but now she wondered if she had been driving Emily away. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of her phone. It was a text from Elliot. Warehouse, 348 Chestnut Avenue. Possible lead. Stay put. Margaret stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Stay put? That wasn't an option. She grabbed her coat and car keys, ignoring the voice in her head that told her she was being reckless. The warehouse was a relic of the city's industrial past, its corrugated metal siding rusted and peeling. Elliot parked a block away, his practiced eye scanning for anything out of place. He stepped out of his car, pulling his coat tighter against the evening chill, and approached the building with cautious steps. The main entrance was padlocked, but a side door hung ajar, its hinges rusted through. Elliot pulled a flashlight from his pocket and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the gloom. The air was damp and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew. Inside, the space was mostly empty, just a few broken pallets and stacks of crumbling boxes. But in the far corner, something caught Elliot's eye. A desk, covered in a thin layer of dust, held an assortment of papers. Elliot sifted through them carefully, his gloved fingers flipping through faded receipts and handwritten notes. One paper stopped him cold. It was a list of names, some crossed out, others circled. At the bottom was a name that made his blood run cold. Emily Lorne. Margaret arrived at the warehouse just as Elliot was stepping outside. He froze when he saw her, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. Margaret, what the hell are you doing here? He demanded. I couldn't just sit at home, she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. You need to trust me to handle this. It's dangerous. Margaret's gaze hardened. Dangerous or not, this is my daughter we're talking about. I have a right to know. Reluctantly, Elliot handed her the paper he had found. Margaret's breath hitched as her eyes scanned the list. Emily's name stared back at her, stark and unyielding. What does this mean? She asked, her voice trembling. It's a hit list, Elliot said grimly. Targets. People the echoes wanted to silence. Margaret's stomach churned. But Emily, she's not crossed out. No, Elliot agreed, which means she might still be alive. Back in his cell, Connor Reed sat across from his attorney, a weary man with a receding hairline and an overstuffed briefcase. The man droned on about strategies for the trial, but Connor wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere on Sophie, on the necklace, and on the judge, who had looked at him like he was holding her world in his hands. The guard's voice cut through his thoughts. "You've got another visitor, Reed." Connor frowned as he was escorted to the visitation room. This time, it wasn't his lawyer or Elliot waiting for him. It was Margaret. She sat stiffly at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. When Connor entered, she met his gaze with a mix of determination and desperation. "Judge Lorne," Connor greeted cautiously as he sat down. "This is unexpected. I need answers," Margaret said without preamble. "Sophie Maynard. The necklace. What aren't you telling us?" Connor hesitated, his fingers twitching against the table. "I told you everything I know." "No, you haven't," Margaret pressed. "Sophie gave you that necklace for a reason. What was she afraid of?" Connor exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "She said they were watching her. People she called the Echoes. She didn't tell me who they were, just that they were powerful enough to make her disappear." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Did she ever mention Caleb Davenport?" Connor's brow furrowed. "Once. She said he was dangerous. But I never met him." Elliot's investigation into the Echoes began to bear fruit. Through informants and old contacts, he pieced together a picture of the group's operations. They were more than a criminal organization. They were a network of influence, manipulating law enforcement, politics, and the judicial system to protect their interests. The name Caleb Davenport appeared repeatedly in connection with high-level decisions. He wasn't just a member of the Echoes, he was a key player, perhaps even their leader. One contact, a former journalist named Teresa Haynes, agreed to meet Elliot at a coffee shop downtown. She was nervous, her eyes darting toward the door every few minutes. "You don't mess with these people," she said, her voice low. "I tried to expose them years ago. Lost my job, my reputation. They erased everything I had." "What do you know about Davenport?" Elliot asked. Teresa hesitated. "He's a ghost. No photos, no records. But if you're chasing him, be careful. He doesn't leave loose ends." The drive home from the warehouse felt like an eternity. Margaret gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, her thoughts spiraling in an endless loop. Emily's name on the list had confirmed what she had feared for years. Her daughter's disappearance wasn't random. It was deliberate. When she arrived home, the house felt unbearably quiet. She sat at the kitchen table, the list Elliot had given her spread out in front of her. Each name seemed to glare back at her, a silent reminder of the lives torn apart by the Echoes. Her phone buzzed. It was Anna, her ever-dedicated clerk. "Judge Lorne, are you all right?" Anna's voice carried her usual concern. Margaret hesitated before responding. "I'm fine, Anna. Just tired." There was a pause. "You don't sound fine. Did something happen?" Margaret glanced at the list again, the weight of it pressing on her chest. "I'll explain tomorrow. For now, I just need to think." The next morning, Margaret arrived at the courthouse early, her mind already set on pressing Elliot for the next steps. But as she stepped through the heavy oak doors, a strange hush greeted her. Staff whispered in tight clusters, their expressions grim. Anna rushed up to her, holding a tablet. "Judge, you need to see this." Margaret took the device, her heart sinking as she read the headline. "Prominent private investigator attacked. Elliot Graham in critical condition." Margaret's legs wobbled, and she reached for the nearest bench to steady herself. "What happened?" "They found him in an alley near his office," Anna said, her voice trembling. "He was beaten badly. They think it's connected to his investigation." Margaret's mind raced. The Echoes. They were sending a message. Later that day, Margaret visited Connor Reed again, her frustration boiling over. "You need to start talking," she said as soon as she sat down across from him. Connor raised an eyebrow. "I already told you everything I know." "No, you told me scraps," Margaret snapped. "People are getting hurt, and my daughter's life is on the line. If you know anything else about Sophie, about the Echoes, now is the time to tell me." Connor's jaw tightened. For a moment, he seemed ready to argue, but then his shoulders slumped. "All right," he muttered. Margaret leaned forward, her breath catching. Sophie didn't just stumble onto the echoes by accident, Connor said. She was looking into them. She thought they had something to do with another girl who disappeared years ago. Another girl? Margaret's voice was sharp. Who? Connor hesitated. Emily Lorne. Margaret's blood ran cold. She knew about Emily? She found a connection between Emily and Caleb Davenport. But before she could tell me what it was, she disappeared. Margaret returned home, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Connor's revelation about Sophie knowing Emily was almost too much to process. She went to her study, pulling out Emily's old diary once again. This time, she combed through every entry with fresh eyes, searching for anything she might have missed. On one page, scrawled in the margins, was a single name, Melanie Maynard. Sophie's sister. Margaret stared at the name, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. If Sophie had been investigating the echoes and Emily, maybe Melanie had answers. The Maynard family's modest home was tucked into a quiet neighborhood. Melanie answered the door, her eyes puffy and red, as though she hadn't slept in days. Judge Lorne? She asked, her voice tinged with confusion. I'm sorry to bother you, Margaret said, forcing a small smile. But I need to talk to you about Sophie. It's important. Melanie hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. The living room was cluttered with photos and mementos of Sophie, each one a painful reminder of the sister Melanie had lost. What do you want to know? Melanie asked, sitting on the edge of the couch. Margaret hesitated. Did Sophie ever talk to you about my daughter? Emily Lorne? Melanie's brow furrowed. Once or twice. She thought Emily's disappearance might be connected to the same people who were threatening her. Margaret's breath hitched. Did she say why? She found a name, Melanie said. Caleb Davenport. She said he was the key to everything. Margaret relayed Melanie's information to Anna and asked her to dig deeper into Caleb Davenport's past. It wasn't long before Anna uncovered something surprising. A property deed for a remote cabin purchased by Davenport shortly after Emily disappeared. Elliot's attack had made Margaret wary, but she knew she couldn't afford to wait. She contacted the police, arranging for a team to accompany her to the cabin. As she prepared for the trip, a sense of foreboding settled over her. This was the closest she had come to finding Emily, but the danger loomed larger than ever. The cabin was deep in the woods. Its isolation made it the perfect hiding place. As the police approached, weapons drawn, Margaret stayed close to the lead officer, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was locked, but a quick breach revealed a dusty interior, cluttered with papers and photographs. On the wall was a corkboard filled with pinned maps, scribbled notes, and, in the center, a photo of Emily. Margaret's knees buckled. She was here, she whispered. One of the officers called out from another room. Judge Lorne, you'll want to see this. Margaret followed the voice to a small, windowless room. Inside was a single chair and a table, covered in fresh food and a folded blanket. Someone's been living here, the officer said. Margaret ran her fingers over the blanket, her chest tightening. It smelled faintly of lavender. As the officers continued their sweep, a noise outside startled the group. Margaret rushed to the door, her heart racing. Emerging from the woods was a woman thin, pale, and wary. Margaret's breath caught. Emily, she whispered. Her daughter froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mom! Margaret ran to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. I thought I lost you, she sobbed. Emily's arms were hesitant at first, but then tightened around her mother. You shouldn't be here, she said softly. It's not safe. Margaret held Emily tightly, unwilling to let go. The weight of 15 years apart melted away in that moment, replaced by the overwhelming relief of finally having her daughter in her arms. But Emily's body was stiff, her embrace tentative. Emily, it's me, Margaret said softly, pulling back to look at her daughter's face. You're safe now. I've been searching for you. Emily shook her head, her eyes darting nervously toward the woods. You shouldn't have come here, Mom. You don't understand. Margaret frowned, her relief giving way to confusion. What don't I understand? Emily, you're my daughter. I've spent every day for 15 years trying to find you. Emily's lips trembled, but her expression hardened. They're watching. If they know you're here, They'll come for both of us. They? Margaret asked. Emily didn't answer immediately. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as though shielding against an unseen threat. The echoes, she said finally. Her voice was barely above a whisper. They're everywhere. Back at the safe house, Emily sat curled up on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest. Margaret hovered nearby, unsure how to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. Elliot, his arm in a sling from the attack, joined them. His gaze was sharp as he studied Emily. You're lucky we found you, he said, his tone neutral but probing. The echoes don't leave loose ends. Emily flinched. You don't think I know that? Margaret placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. Start from the beginning, she urged. Tell us everything. Emily hesitated, her eyes darting between Margaret and Elliot. Finally, she spoke. Caleb Davenport wasn't who I thought he was, she began. When I met him, he seemed kind, supportive. He listened when I talked about feeling trapped, about wanting to escape your rules. She glanced at Margaret, guilt flickering in her eyes. Margaret's heart sank. Emily, I never meant. I know, Mom. Emily interrupted, her voice cracking. I see that now. But back then, I thought leaving with Caleb was my only way out. What happened after you left? Elliot asked, his voice steady but firm. Emily exhaled shakily. At first, it was fine. He took me to this cabin, said it was just temporary until we figured out our next steps. But then things changed. He started getting calls, meeting with people late at night. I overheard him talking about the echoes, about money, power, and disappearances. Margaret felt a cold, knot tighten in her stomach. Disappearances like yours? Emily nodded. I realized too late that I wasn't his partner. I was his pawn. He told me if I ever tried to leave, I'd end up like the others. The others? Elliot leaned forward. Sophie Maynard, Emily said, her voice heavy with regret. She was asking too many questions. Caleb said she knew too much. Margaret gasped. He killed her? Emily hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know, but I know he made her disappear. Elliot spent the next several days digging deeper into Caleb Davenport's operations. Emily's testimony gave him new avenues to explore accounts of secret meetings, coded messages, and hidden payments that pointed to a sprawling network of corruption. One discovery stood out, a ledger recently retrieved from the cabin. It contained names, dates, and transactions tied to high-ranking officials, business leaders, and law enforcement. The ledger was damning, but it wasn't enough. The names were coded, and the entries were deliberately vague. It's like a puzzle, Elliot muttered as he pored over the pages in his office. Margaret entered, her face pale but resolute. What have you found? Elliot tapped the ledger. This is big, Margaret. If we can crack these codes, we'll have enough to dismantle the echoes for good. Margaret studied the pages, her brow furrowed. But we don't have time. If they know Emily's alive, they'll come for her. They already tried with me, Elliot said grimly. But you're right. We need to move fast. Elliot devised a plan. Use Emily as bait to draw the echoes out into the open. It was a dangerous gamble, but with law enforcement stretched thin and corruption rampant, it was their best chance to expose the organization's leadership. Emily was reluctant at first. You're asking me to risk my life, she said, her voice trembling. We're asking you to save others, Elliot replied. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep doing this to more people. Margaret stepped in, her voice gentle but firm. Emily, you're the only one who can do this. But if you're not ready, we'll find another way. Emily looked at her mother, tears welling in her eyes. You'll be with me? Every step of the way, Margaret promised. The courthouse was a fortress by the time the hearing began. Police officers lined the halls, and surveillance teams monitored every entrance. Emily sat at the witness stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she prepared to testify. Margaret sat in the front row, her heart pounding. She wanted to rush to Emily's side, to shield her from the scrutiny of the crowd, but she knew she couldn't. As Emily spoke, recounting her experiences with the echoes and Caleb Davenport, the tension in the room was palpable. Every word she spoke felt like a triumph, a reclamation of her voice after years of silence. But then the fire alarm blared. Margaret's blood ran cold as smoke began to fill the room. Guards rushed to evacuate the building, their movements swift and practiced. Margaret grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the nearest exit. Outside, chaos awaited. Masked operatives swarmed the courthouse steps, their weapons drawn. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets as police engaged the attackers. Margaret shielded Emily with her body, her mind racing with fear and determination. "Stay with me," she whispered, clutching Emily's arm tightly. Elliot appeared beside them, his face grim. "We got to move. Now!" They ran through the chaos, weaving between cars and barricades. The operatives pursued them relentlessly, their precision hinting at military training. Margaret stumbled, but Emily caught her. "We're almost there," Emily shouted, her voice drowned out by the cacophony of the battle. A police van screeched to a halt nearby, and Elliot ushered them inside. "Go," he shouted to the driver. The ambush left the city shaken. Several operatives were captured, but many escaped, leaving behind only traces of their involvement. Among the captured was a mid-level member of the Echoes, who offered just enough information to identify Caleb Davenport's next hideout, a sprawling estate in the countryside. Margaret and Emily stayed in the safe house, the adrenaline of the attack replaced by exhaustion and fear. "We're so close," Elliot told Margaret over the phone. "If we take down Davenport, we can dismantle the whole organization." "Then do it," Margaret said. The safe house buzzed with tension. Emily paced the small living room, her arms wrapped around herself. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the notes and evidence Elliot had brought her before leaving for the estate raid. Every word and photograph carried the weight of lives shattered by the Echoes. Margaret's eyes lingered on a particular name in the ledger: Harper and Associates. A vague memory surfaced, something about a legal firm mentioned in Emily's diary years ago. Margaret reached for her phone. "Anna, I need you to look into Harper and Associates," she said when her clerk answered. Anna sounded hesitant. "Judge Lorne, are you sure this is safe? After what happened at the courthouse." "Just do it," Margaret interrupted, her tone firm. "Of course. I'll call you back when I have something," Anna replied. As Margaret ended the call, Emily stopped pacing and turned toward her. "You're not going to stop, are you?" Margaret looked up at her daughter, her expression resolute. "Not until this is over." Emily hesitated, then sat across from her mother. "I've been running for so long, Mom, but maybe it's time to fight back." Elliot Graham crouched in the shadows outside Caleb Davenport's estate. The sprawling property was heavily guarded, with patrols circling the perimeter and cameras scanning every corner. The tactical team beside him waited for his signal, their faces tense and focused. Elliot adjusted his earpiece. "Everyone in position?" A series of affirmatives crackled through the line. "On my mark," Elliot whispered. The team moved swiftly and silently, cutting through the fence and neutralizing the guards one by one. Elliot led the charge, his gun drawn as they entered the main house. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and cigar smoke. The decor was opulent, but the rooms were eerily quiet. Elliot's instinct screamed at him to stay alert. "Clear," one of the team members called from a side hallway. "Keep moving," Elliot ordered. In the study, they found Davenport's inner sanctum. Files were spread across the desk, along with maps and photographs. Elliot's heart raced as he spotted Emily's face among the papers. "Bag everything," he instructed. "We'll comb through it later." But just as they were securing the evidence, a low rumble shook the room. The walls trembled, and the lights flickered. "Trap!" someone shouted. An explosion tore through the house, throwing Elliot to the ground. Smoke filled the air, and the sound of gunfire erupted as guards stormed the building. Back at the safe house, Margaret waited anxiously for news from Elliot. The hours dragged on, each moment stretching into eternity. Emily sat beside her, tapping nervously on the armrest of her chair. "Do you think he'll make it?" "He has to," Margaret replied, though her voice wavered. Her phone buzzed, and she snatched it up, hoping it was Elliot. But it was Anna. "I found something," Anna said. "Harper and Associates is a front for money laundering. They've been funneling funds for the Echoes for years." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Can you prove it?" "I'm working on it," Anna said. "But it's complicated. They've buried their tracks well. Margaret hung up, frustration boiling over. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step behind. Elliot stumbled out of the wreckage of Davenport's estate, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. The raid had gone sideways, the explosion throwing the operation into chaos. Several team members were injured, and Davenport had escaped. But Elliot clutched a single folder, the edges singed, as he made his way to the extraction point. Inside the folder were the keys to the Echo's operations, coded transactions, lists of names, and a possible location for Davenport's next move. "We're not done yet," Elliot muttered to himself, determination flaring despite the pain coursing through his body. Elliot arrived at the safe house battered but alive. Margaret opened the door, relief washing over her as she helped him inside. "Are you all right?" she asked, guiding him to the couch. "I've been worse," Elliot replied, wincing as he sat down. He handed her the folder. "This is what we found." Margaret opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. The names and transactions confirmed what they already suspected, but one detail stood out. A location marked on a map with a single word beside it, Haven. "What's Haven?" Margaret asked. Elliot shook his head. "I don't know, but it's our next move." Emily leaned over the map, her expression dark. "I've heard that name before. Davenport mentioned it once. He said it was a safe place for people like him." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Then we're going there." The raid on Haven was swift and brutal. Law enforcement, armed with the evidence Elliot had gathered, stormed the compound. They arrested several members of the Echoes and seized more documents, computers, and cash. But Davenport was nowhere to be found. Margaret watched from a distance as officers led the suspects away in handcuffs. It felt like a hollow victory. "What now?" she asked Elliot. "We keep going," he replied. "This isn't over." That evening, Emily sat with Margaret on the porch of the safe house. The stars were faint but visible, a quiet reminder of the world beyond their chaos. "Do you think it's really over?" Emily asked softly. Margaret hesitated. "I think we've struck a blow, but there's still work to be done." Emily nodded, her gaze distant. "I want to help. I've spent so long hiding, running. I want to do something that matters." Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You've already done so much, Emily. But if this is what you want, I'll be with you every step of the way." Margaret stared at the folder spread out on the table in the safe house. The name Haven was circled on the map, but its promise of resolution felt hollow. The raid had yielded arrests and documents, yet the figure at the center of it all, Caleb Davenport, remained elusive. Emily joined her at the table, the faint scent of lavender wafting as she pulled a chair close. "You think he's still out there?" Margaret nodded, her jaw tight. "He's not the type to run forever. Davenport's too arrogant to stay hidden for long." Emily rested her chin in her hands, her eyes scanning the notes. "I've been thinking," she said softly. "If Haven wasn't his final destination, then it's just another part of the web. What if he's setting up somewhere else, using the chaos to his advantage?" Margaret's stomach churned. Emily had a point. Davenport had always been strategic. Elliot entered the room, still favoring his injured shoulder. He carried a tablet, his face grim. "You're not going to like this," he said, setting it on the table. On the screen was live footage of a press conference. A reporter addressed the camera, her voice sharp with urgency. "Authorities believe Davenport has fled the country, but his influence continues to linger. Sources indicate that the Echoes remain operational, with corruption reaching even the highest levels of government." Margaret's chest tightened. "He's making a statement. He wants us to know he's untouchable." "Not for long," Elliot said firmly. "We've got one last shot to corner him." Elliot revealed a lead uncovered during the raid on Haven, a communication log pointing to an upcoming meeting between Davenport and several high-ranking members of the Echoes. The meeting was scheduled to take place at a private airstrip, where Davenport likely planned to leave the country. "It's risky," Elliot admitted, his finger tracing the map. "The airstrip's isolated, heavily guarded. We'll have one chance to intercept him before he's gone for good." Margaret studied the map, her determination hardening. "Then we make it count." Emily hesitated. "You're not going alone." Margaret turned to her daughter, her heart aching with a mix of pride and fear. "Emily, this isn't your fight anymore. You've done enough. Emily's eyes flashed. This was never just your fight, Mom. If we don't stop him now, he'll keep doing this to more families, more people like Sophie and me. I'm coming with you. Margaret wanted to protest, but saw the resolve in her daughter's face. She nodded reluctantly. Stay close to me. No heroics. The air was thick with tension as Margaret, Emily, and Elliot approached the airstrip. The tactical team moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the gravel beneath them. In the distance, the faint hum of an aircraft engine grew louder. Elliot signaled for the team to split into positions, their weapons ready. He handed Margaret a headset, his voice low in her ear. We're on a clock. Once that plane starts taxiing, it's over. Margaret nodded, gripping Emily's hand tightly as they followed the team toward the hangar. Inside, Davenport's men were loading crates onto the plane. Margaret spotted Davenport at the center of the chaos, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the flurry of activity around him. That's him, Margaret whispered. Elliot nodded. We wait for my signal. But Emily, her emotions boiling over, stepped forward before Margaret could stop her. Caleb, she shouted, her voice echoing through the hangar. The room froze. Davenport turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Emily. For a moment, surprise flickered across his face before he smiled. Emily, he said, his voice smooth and mocking. I wondered when I'd see you again. Margaret stepped forward, placing herself between Davenport and her daughter. It's over, Caleb. There's nowhere left for you to run. Davenport chuckled, his hands casually sliding into his pockets. You really think you've won? You have no idea how deep this goes, Judge. Emily's fists clenched. You used me. You used Sophie. How many others have you destroyed just to keep your empire intact? Davenport's smile faded. You were a means to an end, Emily. Don't make this personal. It's always been personal, Margaret snapped. Davenport's men began to move, their hands reaching for weapons. But Elliot's team burst into the hangar, guns raised. Drop your weapons. Elliot barked. For a moment, the room was a standoff. Then, with a reluctant nod from Davenport, his men lowered their guns. As the team secured Davenport's men, Margaret and Emily watched as he was placed in handcuffs. But Davenport's calm demeanor unnerved Margaret. You think this end with me? He said as he was led past her. You've only cut off one head of the Hydra. The echoes will rise again. Margaret's jaw tightened. We'll be ready. Davenport smirked. We'll see. As the team escorted him to the waiting vehicles, a sudden explosion rocked the hangar. Flames erupted from one of the crates, throwing everyone into chaos. Elliot grabbed Margaret and Emily, pulling them behind cover. It's a distraction, he shouted. In the confusion, Davenport slipped free, disappearing into the smoke. The next morning, Margaret sat in her study, the events at the airstrip replaying in her mind. Davenport was gone, but his empire had taken a significant blow. Emily entered, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She set one down in front of her mother, sitting across the table. You did everything you could, Emily said gently. It wasn't enough, Margaret replied, her voice heavy with regret. Emily reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. It's not over, and we'll face whatever comes next together. Months passed, and the echoes began to fracture under the weight of continued investigations. The arrests at the airstrip had led to a cascade of confessions and plea deals, exposing more of the organization's inner workings. Margaret retired from the bench, choosing to dedicate her time to advocating for victims of organized crime. Emily joined her, using her story to inspire others to come forward. One evening, they sat on the porch of Margaret's home, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Do you ever think about what's next? Emily asked. Margaret smiled, her gaze distant. Every day, but for the first time in years, I feel hopeful. Emily nodded, her hand resting on her growing belly. Me too. As the stars emerged, Margaret and Emily sat together, their bond stronger than ever. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they were no longer a source of pain. They were a testament to their resilience, a reminder of the journey that had brought them here. And as the night deepened, a quiet peace settled over them, promising brighter days ahead. The days following the airstrip raid were chaotic. Margaret and Emily stayed in the safe house, now more fortified with law enforcement, while Elliot coordinated a task force to trace Davenport's movements. The explosion had destroyed critical evidence, leaving them with only fragments to piece together the next steps. Margaret watched Emily carefully. Her daughter's determination to confront Davenport had been courageous, but it had also shaken her. Emily's nights were restless, her sleep punctuated by muffled cries and flinches. One morning, as Emily sat at the table with a cup of untouched tea, Margaret joined her. "You did something brave back there," Margaret said softly. Emily looked up, her expression clouded with doubt. "I let him get away." "You faced him," Margaret replied, her tone firm. "You spoke your truth, and that's more than most people could have done. This fight isn't over, Emily, and you're stronger than you think." Emily's lips trembled, but she nodded. "I just want it to end." Elliot returned to the safe house one evening, his face lined with exhaustion but lit with a spark of hope. "I think we've got something," he said, placing a folder on the table. Margaret and Emily leaned over the documents as Elliot explained. "One of the men we arrested at Haven has agreed to talk. He's terrified of Davenport, but he's more afraid of spending the rest of his life in prison." "What did he say?" Margaret asked. "He confirmed that Davenport is still in the country," Elliot replied. "He's regrouping, trying to secure what's left of the Echoes. He's planning another move, something big." Emily frowned. "Did he say where?" Elliot nodded. "A private estate in the mountains. It's secluded, heavily fortified. But this time, we have the element of surprise." The days leading up to the raid were a blur of planning and coordination. Elliot worked closely with law enforcement to ensure the operation's success, while Margaret and Emily prepared emotionally for what was to come. One evening, Margaret found Emily in her room, holding the necklace she had worn the day she disappeared. "I thought I'd lost this," Emily said, her voice soft. Margaret sat beside her. "It was always with me, a reminder of you." Emily looked at her mother, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never stopped thinking about you, Mom, even when I was terrified, even when I thought I'd never see you again. I missed you." Margaret pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. "I missed you too, and no matter what happens, we'll get through this together." The raid on Davenport's mountain estate was meticulously planned. The team approached under the cover of darkness, moving swiftly through the dense forest that surrounded the property. Margaret and Emily stayed behind in a secure location nearby, listening to updates through the communication system. Elliot's voice crackled over the line, steady and focused. "Perimeter secured. Moving in," he reported. Inside the estate, Davenport's operations were in full swing. The team encountered resistance but pressed forward, clearing room after room. Elliot's determination was palpable as they reached the heart of the compound, a sprawling office filled with monitors and files. Davenport stood at the center, his expression calm despite the chaos. "You're persistent," he said as Elliot entered. "And you're finished," Elliot replied. Davenport didn't go quietly. He triggered a failsafe, setting off alarms and sealing exits. His remaining guards fought desperately, buying him time to escape through a hidden passage. Elliot pursued him into the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the estate, his heart pounding. Davenport was fast, but Elliot's resolve was stronger. When he finally caught up, Davenport stood at the edge of a cliff, the moonlight casting a shadow over his face. "You're out of moves," Elliot said, his gun trained on the fugitive. Davenport smirked. "You think this in with me? The Echoes aren't just an organization, they're an idea. You can't kill an idea." "We'll see about that," Elliot replied. Before Davenport could respond, a team of officers arrived, surrounding him. Realizing he had no escape, Davenport raised his hands in surrender. The arrest of Caleb Davenport marked a turning point. His capture exposed more layers of corruption within the Echoes, leading to a cascade of arrests and the dismantling of the organization's infrastructure. Margaret and Emily watched the news coverage together, their relief tempered by the knowledge that the road to recovery would be long. "You did it," Emily said, her voice filled with awe. Margaret shook her head. "We did it. Together." With Davenport behind bars, Margaret and Emily began the process of rebuilding their lives. Margaret returned to her advocacy work, using her platform to push for reforms in the justice system. Emily found her voice in a different way. She began speaking at events, sharing her story to raise awareness about the dangers of manipulation and the resilience of the human spirit. One evening, as they sat together in Margaret's living room, Emily held up a flyer for a local support group. "I'm thinking about starting one of these," she said, "for people like me." Margaret smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "You'd be incredible at it." The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon as Margaret and Emily stood on the porch of their home, watching the day begin. "We've come a long way," Emily said, her voice quiet but hopeful. Margaret nodded. "And we'll keep moving forward." For the first time in years, they felt a sense of peace, of fragile but growing hope that the future held lighter than darkness. As the world woke around them, they turned to face it together, ready for whatever came next. Months later, Margaret and Emily stood in front of a packed auditorium, speaking to an audience about their journey. "We survived because we never stopped fighting," Margaret said, her voice strong. "And because we had each other." The audience erupted in applause, their support a testament to the power of hope and resilience. As Margaret and Emily left the stage, they knew their journey wasn't over, but they were ready for the road ahead, united by a bond that nothing could break. As Margaret and Emily stepped off the stage, their hearts were full. Their journey had been long and fraught with pain, but it had led them to this moment, a chance to inspire and bring hope to others. Margaret turned to Emily, her voice soft but firm. "If sharing our story can help even one person find the strength to keep going, then it's all been worth it." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, it's the stories we hear that remind us we're not alone." Margaret smiled and looked out toward the camera, addressing not just the audience in the auditorium, but those watching at home. "If our story moved you, if it gave you strength or hope, we'd love for you to join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories of resilience and courage, because together we can face anything.